Hello, beautiful soul. Welcome back to Everything Within podcast. I'm your host, Alina Krasnojon. This podcast is all about empowering you to build an extraordinary, fulfilling life and tap into the limitless potential that resides within you. Thank you for tuning in today. You're doing everything right. You're repeating the affirmations, you're making the vision boards, you're in therapy, you're taking the courses, you're building the habits. You're trying to show up differently, and yet somehow you keep ending up in the same place, the same patterns, the same fear, the same scarcity, the same voice that whispers you're not doing enough, you're not moving fast enough, you're not enough. You sabotage yourself right when things start to shift. You judge yourself for not being further along. You wonder why the habits won't stick, why the action feels so heavy. While despite everything you're doing, the life you're trying to build still feels just out of reach. And then you add one more thing to the list, one more tool, one more method, one more attempt to push through. I know this because it was me. For years, this was me. And here is what I eventually had to face. I wasn't broken, I wasn't behind, I wasn't failing at the work. I was just trying to build something new on the top of the foundation I had never once stopped to look at. We spent so much time trying to add new habits, new beliefs, new routines, new identity, and almost no time asking what is the ground I'm building on. Because beneath all of your efforts, beneath everything you're consciously trying to create, there is an invisible foundation. Layers of conditioning, of old stories, of survival patterns, of ways of being in the world that were shaped long before you had any say in the matter. Your family, your culture, your wounds, the story you've been telling yourself about who you are and what's possible for you. You can't see it clearly because it doesn't feel like conditioning. It feels like you. It feels like the truth, but it isn't. And until you start to deconstruct it, until you excavate those layers, hold them up to the light, and decide for yourself what is actually true and what you're ready to release, you will keep hitting the same ceiling. Not because you're not trying hard enough, but because you're trying to build a new life on a foundation that was never yours to begin with. That is what today's episode is about. We are going to go deep. We are going to look at the 4 layers that form this invisible foundation. Your family conditioning, the stories handed to you by culture and society, your trauma, and the sense of self that was built from all of it. We are going to name them, feel them, and start to see them clearly. Not to tear you apart, but to clear the ground, so that what you build next is actually genuinely yours. Because you can't manifest a life that is true for you while you're still living inside someone else's blueprint. So let's start at the beginning, let's go underneath, let's begin. Most personal development sits on the top of an uninspected self. I didn't realize this for a long time, even when I was deep in the work, reading everything, doing courses, going to therapy, working with coaches. I was still operating from the same assumption that almost all self-development is built on. There is a higher self out there, some better, more evolved version of you, and your job is to keep striving toward it, to add more, to become more, to finally one day arrive. And I want to stop here for a moment because I have a real problem with this concept of a higher self. What does it even mean? Think about what it's actually saying. It's saying that who you are right now, in this moment, with everything you've lived through, everything you carry, everything you are, is not enough. That there is a superior version of you somewhere ahead, and until you reach it, you are essentially a work in progress, incomplete, insufficient. Your mind loves this idea, by the way, because as long as you're chasing a higher self, you never have to fully arrive. You never have to sit with yourself as you are and say, this is enough, I am enough right now as I am. The chase becomes a way of avoiding the very acceptance that would actually set you free. So you keep adding new habits, new beliefs, new identities, new frameworks for who you should become. and none of it sticks in any deep, lasting way, because we're decorating a house without ever looking at the foundations. Here is the distinction I want to offer instead. There is no a higher self and a lower self. There is a conditioned self and an authentic self. The conditioned self is not your enemy, it's not a flaw, it was an act of intelligence, a survival strategy that your mind and body developed to keep you safe, accepted, and loved in the specific environment you grew up in. It was brilliant, actually, at the time. Because here is the truth. You were not born anxious. You were not born people-pleasing. You were not born afraid to take up space, afraid to speak your needs, afraid to be seen. None of that was original to you. As children, we arrive knowing exactly who we are. We can see it, the unfiltered joy, the unshamed need, the complete willingness to be fully, messily, loudly yourself. That is not something we learn, that is what we start with. But then life happens, and as children, we are very sensitive to our environment, because our survival literally depends on the adults around us. So when we sense that our needs are too much, that our emotions make our caregivers uncomfortable, that being too loud or too sad or too bold or too needy creates distance or disapproval or fear, we adapt, we shrink, we hide, we become who we need to be in order to be loved. And if you grew up without emotionally mature caregivers, without adults who could hold your emotions without flinching, who could validate your feelings without shutting them down, who could offer you unconditional presence rather than conditional approval, then this adaptation went even deeper. You didn't just adjust, you built an entirely new self, a survival self, a self designed not to thrive, but to get through. That self kept you safe, and that self is now running your adult life, whether you realize it or not. And here is when it gets really important, because this is the part most personal development completely misses. The problem is often not just that you lack motivation, it's not that you lack discipline. Honestly, I don't even love those words. They put the blame back on you, as if the issue is some personal failing rather than something much deeper. The real issue is that what you think you want, your goals, your dreams, your vision of a good life may not actually be yours. The desires you're trying to motivate yourself toward may have been inherited rather than chosen, shaped by expectations, by what you were told a good life looks like, or formed as a direct response to pain, to growing up in poverty, to having parents who made you feel unsafe, to experiences that left a mark so deep you built your entire direction around them without even realizing it. I see this more and more. People reaching their 30s, their 40s, standing inside the career they worked so hard for, inside the relationship they thought they wanted, and feeling hollow, not because they failed, but because they succeeded at building something else's dream, because their choices were never really free choices, conscious choices. They were trauma responses dressed up as ambitions. That is exactly why you often don't feel inspired. That is why motivation won't stay, because when you're motivated towards something that isn't deeply authentically yours, your whole body knows it, even if your mind doesn't yet. Now I want to be honest with you. Uncovering your authentic desires doesn't mean everything becomes effortless. Life is still life. Hard days are still hard. But there is a difference, a real, felt, undeniable difference between striving toward something that is truly yours and grinding toward something that was handed to you. Even on the difficult days, it feels different. It feels like yours. And so before we talk about deconstruction, before we go into the layers, I want to leave you with one question to sit with. What if the self you've been trying to improve was never really yours to begin with? Not as a way of dismissing everything you've done, not as a reason to give up, but as an invitation to go deeper than improvement, to go all the way down to the root, to ask not how I become a better version of myself, but who I am underneath everything I was taught to be. The first layer and the deepest family. This one is the hardest to deconstruct, not because it's the most complex, but because it got inside you before you even had words for it, before you had the cognitive capacity to question anything, to filter anything, to protect yourself from any of it. You were an open system, a small, exquisitely sensitive human being absorbing everything. Not just what was said to you, but what was felt in the room. The tension at the dinner table that nobody named, the way your mother's body changed when money came up, the things your father never talked about, the emotions that were welcome and the ones that made everyone uncomfortable, the love that was conditional, even if nobody said so out loud. All of it went directly into your unconscious, because the young psyche is fragile and your brain was not yet developed enough to do anything except receive. There was no filter, there was no critical mind standing at the door saying, wait, is this actually true? There was just you, small and dependent and wired for connection, absorbing the world through the people you needed most. So ask yourself, really ask. What were the unspoken rules your family lived by? Not the things they said, but the things they lived. Was money something that flowed, or something that was always slipping away, always scarce, always stressful? Did your parents struggle to meet your basic needs? And if they did, how did that feel in your body as a child? Did it feel like the world was safe? Did it feel like you were safe? What was the story about what your family was allowed to have? What was the ceiling on joy, on success, on wanting more? How did love look like? Was it freely given, or did it have to be earned? Were you allowed to be angry? Were you allowed to be sad? Were you allowed to take up space, to have needs, to fall apart sometimes and be held without anyone making you feel like a burden? Was it safe, truly safe, to be fully yourself, without apologizing, without shrinking, without hiding the parts of you that were inconvenient or too much or not enough? These questions matter because the answers, whatever they are, became the lens through which you see yourself and the world today, whether you're aware of it or not, whether you want to accept it or not. And here is where it gets tender, because when you start doing this work, when you really start to see what was absorbed, what was inherited, what was done, the first feeling that often arrives is anger, blame. Why did they do this to me? Why wasn't I protected from this? And I want to say something carefully here. Your parents, most of them, were not handing you these beliefs as lessons they consciously chose. They were passing on what had been handed to them by their parents and their parents before that. Generational conditioning runs deep. They were doing their best with what they had, with the emotional tools they were given, or more often the ones they weren't. Understanding that doesn't mean diminishing your pain. It doesn't mean pretending the suffering wasn't real, or that the trauma didn't happen, or that the wounds aren't there. You can't hold both. You can have compassion for where your parents came from and still choose in your adult life to have very clear, very firm boundaries with them. Understanding someone's story is not the same as tolerating their behavior. Those two things can coexist at the same time. But the blame, if you stay there, keeps you a victim of something that already happened. And you are not a victim. The sooner you will be able to get rid of the victim mindset, the sooner you will be able to change your life. Because this is not about assigning fault, it's about being honest with yourself, about looking at the foundation and saying, okay, this is what I was given and this is the lens I inherited. And now, what I'm going to do with that? You didn't choose your family's relationships with money. You didn't choose their story about love. You didn't choose what they taught you silently, unintentionally, deeply, about what someone like you is allowed to have, to be, to want. But you are choosing now. The moment you see it, you are choosing. So sit with this. What did my family teach me about what I deserve, about what's possible for someone like me? And ask what was theirs and what is actually mine. Now we go wider, because beyond your family there's a larger net. Culture, nationality, religion, gender, class, race, media, These systems were operating on you just as quietly, just as constantly, and in some ways they are even harder to deconstruct than family. Because at least with family you can point to specific people, specific moments, specific things that were said. With culture, it's everywhere and nowhere. It's the water you swim in. It's the air. Culture creates unspoken standards, unquestioned assumptions that everyone around you is simply living by, so naturally, so universally, that they stop looking like assumptions at all. They just look like reality, like the way things are, like common sense. And yes, some of these will be different depending on where in the world you're from, how traditional the country you grew up in was, what religion or community shaped your early life. But here is what's also true. The world is becoming more and more the same. Social media, the internet, global capitalism, they have created a kind of universal culture layered on the top of everything else. A set of images and standards and templates for what a good life looks like that now reaches almost everywhere. So let's get specific, because this layer deserves specificity. If you're a woman, what was the narrative you absorbed about what your life should look like? Was marriage the goal that everything else was organized around? Were the relationships and children presented as the primary measure of your worth, the things by which you would ultimately be judged? Were you taught explicitly or implicitly to manage the emotions of the people around you, to make yourself smaller so others could feel bigger, to sacrifice your needs as an expression of love, to erase yourself and call it devotion? Maybe the expectation was about appearance, about maintaining a certain look, a certain body, a certain desirability, because without it, you become invisible. And if you learned early on to measure your worth by whether men found you desirable, then at some point, without even realizing it, you began to see yourself through someone else's eyes. You began to search for external validation as the only proof that you were enough. And that search, that constant, exhausting search, became a part of how you moved through the world. There is also the shrinking narrative. Don't be too much, don't be too loud, don't be too ambitious, too visible, too opinionated, too big. Make yourself easy to be around, don't take up too much space. And it is remarkable how deeply this gets absorbed, how many brilliant, capable, extraordinary women I see still making themselves smaller in rooms where they have every right to be fully present. And then there is the hustle narrative, which cuts across genders, across cultures, and has become almost universal in the modern world. The belief that you must earn your worth through productivity, that rest is laziness, and if you're not achieving, growing, optimizing, building, you're falling behind, that your value as a human being is directly tied to your output. And I want to ask you something honestly. Do you feel guilty when you rest? Not tired, guilty, like you should be doing something, like this stillness itself is the kind of failure, like you haven't yet earned the right to just be. Because if you do, that is not a personal flaw, that is conditioning. That is the story you absorbed from a culture that profits from your restlessness, that keeps you consuming and producing and striving, because a person who is at peace with themselves is very difficult to sell things to. And if you grew up in a family where achievement was the currency of love, where doing well, performing well, being successful, what was made you visible and valued, then the hustle narrative didn't just come from outside, it got reinforced from the inside too. And now it sits so deep that you might have mistaken it for who you are, for ambition, for drive, where really underneath it, it might just be fear that if you stop, you will disappear, that if you rest, you will be found out, that your worth was always conditional, and the condition is performing. And then on the top of all of it, there is social media, the performance of a life, the perfectly curated images of what success looks like, what happiness looks like, what your body should look like, what your relationships should look like, what you should want at 30, at 40, at 50. The algorithm, which is not neutral, it is designed to show you whatever makes you feel most inadequate, most behind, most in need of something you don't yet have. Constant comparison, constant exposure to the highlight reels of other people's carefully constructed presentations of themselves. And it becomes almost impossible to know, in the middle of all of this, what you actually want, what is genuinely yours, because the noise is so loud, and it has been so loud for so long that your own voice starts to become very quiet. Culture doesn't just tell you what to want, it tells you what wanting the right things looks like. The shape of the dream was pre-designed, the template was already there when you arrived. The dream house, the right relationship, the successful career, the certain number in the bank account, the body, the lifestyle. You didn't design that image, you inherited it. And then you spent years, maybe decades, trying to motivate yourself toward a destination that was never really yours. So ask yourself, how much of what I am working toward was chosen by me, and how much was chosen for me by the culture I grew up in, by the system I was swimming in before I was old enough to question them. Was that yours, or was it handed to you? And the third layer, and I want to be careful here, because this word, trauma, has a way of making people either over-identify or immediately check out. That's not me, I didn't have a terrible childhood, I'm fine. So let me reframe it before we go any further. Trauma isn't only the big, named events. It isn't only the things that would make someone else gasp. It is also, and perhaps more commonly, the slow accumulation of moments where you learned that it wasn't safe to be fully yourself. The moments your emotions were too much for the room, the times you were shamed for needing something, the experiences where you got love and attention for performing, for being good, being helpful, being easy, rather than for simply being. The moments that taught you, quietly and repeatedly, that the full version of you was too much, or not enough, or somehow dangerous to show. And it doesn't stop in childhood. We can be re-traumatized in our adult lives too. The relationships where your trust was broken, the workplace that ground you down, the relationship that made you feel invisible. Life keeps handling us moments that either deepen old wounds or carve new ones. And in response to all of it, you adapted. Because that is what humans do. We developed strategies, brilliant, creative, necessary strategies to keep yourself safe in environments that didn't feel safe. The hypervigilance that made you constantly scan for danger became what people call being driven. The people-pleasing that kept conflict at bay became being easy to be around. The emotional disconnection that protected you from feeling too much became being independent. The hiding, the shrinking, the self-erasure became a way of avoiding abandonment or staying acceptable and never giving anyone a reason to leave. These are not character's flaw, they are not weaknesses, they are survival intelligence. They were the most brilliant solutions your nervous system could find to the problems it was facing. They worked, they kept going. But here's the thing about the survival strategies. They don't automatically retire when the threat is gone. They keep running long after you've left the house, left the relationship, left the environment that required them. They became automatic, they became habitual, and eventually they become what you think of as your personality. You are not your wounds. Your wounds shaped how you learned to move through the world, but they are not the truth of who you are. The anxiety, the people-pleasing, the armor, the constant doing, the fear of being truly seen, these are not you. They are what you became in response to what happened to you. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this work. So ask yourself, what parts of my personality were actually responses to pain, and do I still need them? Now we arrive at the deepest layer of all, the story of I. I'm an anxious person, I'm not a creative type, I'm someone who struggles with money, I'm too sensitive, I'm not disciplined enough, I'm not enough. You know the one. You've probably been saying it so long, it doesn't even feel like a story anymore. It just feels like a fact, like something you discovered about yourself, the way you might discover your eye color or your blood type. Fixed, true, simply the way you are. But where did that story begin? If you trace it back, really trace it, you will almost always find a moment, a single comment from a teacher, a year when everything fell apart, a parent who compared you to a sibling too many times, a relationship that confirmed every fear you already had about yourself. One moment, one voice, one experience, and then you spent the next 10, 20, 30 years quietly collecting evidence that it was true. Because that is what self-concept does. It is self-fulfilling. You filter everything through the story you already believe, which means the evidence that confirms it gets amplified. You notice it, remember it, hold onto it, and the evidence that contradicts it gets dismissed. That was a coincidence, that doesn't count, that wasn't really me. The story protects itself. It is extraordinarily good at surviving. And the most insidious part, the part that makes this layer the hardest to deconstruct, is that it doesn't feel like a story. It feels like you. It feels like the truest, most intimate thing about yourself, which is exactly why most people never question it. Why would you question yourself? Why would you investigate the very lens you're looking through? But the self is not a fixed thing you discovered. It is a story, and it was mostly written by people in circumstances you didn't choose before you had anywhere near the awareness or the language or the power to question any of it. That is not a small thing to realize. Take a moment with it. You have just walked through 4 layers: family, the unconscious rules absorbed before you had words, culture, the templates handed to you by systems you were born into, trauma, the adaptations your nervous system built to keep you safe, and now this, the story of self that was assembled from all of it, that calcified into identity, that became the voice in your head you mistake for truth. None of these layers were chosen consciously, not one, and yet all of them right now, today, are shaping what you believe you deserve, what you think is possible, what you think you are, what you allow yourself to want, what you allow yourself to become. That is the foundation you have been building on. And now, finally, you can see it. I want to pause here for a moment, because what we just moved through is not light. Looking at your conditioning, really looking at it, can feel like grief, because it is grief. You are mourning something real, the childhood that you should have felt safer, the version of you that was shaped by pain before you could even name it, the years spent chasing a life that was never really yours, the parts of yourself you hid, suppressed, armored over, because the world around you didn't have room for them. And underneath all of that, there is often this particular ache, the realization that so much of what formed you was completely beyond your control. You didn't choose it, you didn't ask for it, and yet here you are, carrying it. That is a hard thing to accept. It is worth letting yourself feel that, rather than moving past it too quickly. But here is where I want to offer you a different way of seeing this. Deconstruction is not destruction. You are not tearing yourself apart to be left with nothing. You are not dismantling your identity to discover that there is no one home. This is not nihilism. This is not nothing is real or I have no self. It is the exact opposite. It is the painstaking, courageous work of finding what is actually real, what is actually yours, beneath all the layers that were placed on top of you before you had any say in the matter. And this is also not about becoming some fully healed, never triggered, permanently enlightened version of yourself that is just higher self-concept in a different costume. This work is not about transcending your humanity. It's about coming home to it. It's about looking at every part of yourself, including the shadow parts, the messy parts, the parts you are ashamed of, and saying, I see you, you make sense, you are always doing your best, you belong here too. Integration, not erasure. Because here is what I know to be true. Underneath the conditioning, underneath the survival strategies, underneath the inherited stories, the cultural templates and the wounds, there is something that was never touched by any of it. The curiosity that lit you up as a child, The love that moves through you when you stop performing, the creativity, the knowing, the values that feel so deep and so steady they couldn't have been given to you by anyone. Those were always there. They didn't go anywhere. The layers just made them hard to hear. Deconstruction clears the way back to them. You are not becoming someone new, you are remembering who you always were before the world told you who to be. And yes, there will be a period in this work where you don't quite know who you are, where the old stories have started to loosen, but the new ground doesn't yet feel solid. That in-between space is uncomfortable. It can feel like being lost, but it's not being lost. It is the most honest place you have ever stood, and it is exactly where real transformation lives. Not in the certainty, but in the willingness to stay with the question long enough for something true to emerge. So from here, from this clear ground, from this more spacious and honest place, I want to ask you, what do you actually want? Not what you were taught to want, not what looks good from the outside, not what you think you should want by now. What does the life you actually want to live look like? What desires have been sitting quietly underneath all the noise, waiting for you to have enough room to finally hear them? Because from this space, when you know yourself more honestly, when you can hear your own voice beneath all the inherited ones, you can start to build something that is genuinely yours. A life that feels like yours, that moves from joy rather than fear, from desire rather than obligation, from a deep inner knowing rather than constant external validation. You don't have to force motivation when you are moving toward something that is truly yours. It feels different. Even on hard days, it feels different. That is what becomes possible and what you can manifest when you deconstruct first. This kind of work doesn't happen in a podcast episode. It happens in quiet moments, in the pause before you react, in a sudden noticing, wait, where did that thought come from? Is that actually mine? It happens slowly, in layers, over time, which is exactly how it should. Now, I'm not asking you to change your whole life this week. I'm not asking you to have a breakthrough by Friday. I'm just asking you to start seeing, because the moment you can see the foundation, really see it, it already begins to lose its power over you. So here is one thing I want you to do after this episode. Take one belief you hold about yourself, just one, something you say often, something that feels true and fixed and simple the way you are. Maybe it's I'm not good with money, maybe it's I'm not the kind of person who, maybe it's I always end up alone, I always self-sabotage, I'm too much, I'm not enough. Write it down and then ask, where did this come from? Who said this first? Was it me or was it someone else? Is it actually true or is it a story I inherited and never once stopped to question? And then ask the most important one, if I didn't believe this, who would I be? You don't need the answer today. You don't need to have it all figured out. Just sit with the question. Let it work on you. That is enough. That is in fact the beginning of everything. Because the most radical act of self-love isn't adding more to yourself. It isn't becoming more, achieving more, striving towards some better version of yourself that's always just out of reach. It's having the courage to look at what you've been carrying and ask whether it was really yours, and then gently, finally, letting it go. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Until the next time, bye!